Hey everyone, today I'm talking with Ari Mazziota, his second time on the Polymath podcast. Ari's been pursuing a master's degree in clinical mental health, and he's a personal trainer and also a fantastic drummer and a technical death metal band, which is one of the best kinds of drumming in my opinion. If you'd like to support this podcast, please check the links in the description. How's it going everyone? Welcome to the Polymath Park podcast. I'm here with Ari Mazziota again, and today we're discussing philosophy of religion and the history of religiosity. So, what does religiosity versus religion mean to you?
Just for clarification, would you say religiosity is like the general practice of, binding together with other people to interpret and experience spiritual ideas together? And religion would be like the specific, form of that, or the preferred method of doing so.
That's probably what I hear most people talk about it as. So I'm gonna show you an example here in a bit. I used an image, I uploaded an image of religiosity straight to ChatGPT and actually found its origins and the name of the image, which I've been wondering about for years. ChatGPT says, religion typically refers to systems of beliefs and institutions, doctrines, and rituals, and the involvement of sacred texts. So yeah, that makes sense. And religiosity is kind of like the individual practice, personal commitments, behaviors and attitudes towards those beliefs, and the social and psychological aspects. So this would be like kind of what Vervaeke and Grant Henriquez and Jonathan Pageau are talking about in their recent explorations into this. I guess when we're asking like what is worth preserving from religious belief systems and just religion in general, is this kind of religiosity. So the act of ritual, like there's a role for that, the act of embodying and enacting the sacred, I guess you could say, or just considering what is most valuable. Like there's also contention in the definitions of sacredness and just generally valuable things like virtues and values and all that. And that's very useful. The way I think about this is the whole Pascal's God-shaped whole argument. Pascal was talking about this a few hundred years ago. The idea is that every human carries within him a God-shaped whole, where we're biologically set up to be superstitious, or set up to consider something either as a higher power or just have some kind of spiritual action and spiritual belief. Now, when it comes to belief, that's where I start to see problems, because your beliefs can be very deceiving, and science tends to tell us that we don't have to believe anything, just follow the facts, and that also leads us into problems. But I tend to lean that way of thinking, because logic and reason tend to be, like, that's what's at the heart of therapy, and in my opinion. Like, that's the most effective therapies are those that allow us to think more rationally and thus behave more rationally. But that's kind of another topic.
Yeah.
So
Makes
what
sense.
parts how do you feel about that? Like, what do you consider as valuable from religion, I guess?
I think people get different values from their religious beliefs and practices. Sometimes it's more cultural, right? Where like your religion provides a framework for understanding life, but also just the practical stuff, right? Like maybe like institutions, such as like marriage, or how funerals go, and how you process different things such as that. Like coming of age. You could have, I know, like Catholicism, right? You have your catechism and then your first communion and all that, right? And that's a way of like processing, not only aging, but making commitments to your faith, which again I have problems with too. But again, I think that demonstrates a sort of framework for just normal life processes, such as aging, or marriage, companionship, those kind of things. They seem to be kind of natural things, but they're, by institutionalizing them, you're kind of formalizing the process, maybe, which
Right.
could be useful to people as well.
What was that word you used? It started with a C or something?
Oh, I already can't remember.
Oh, that's cool. Well,
Catechism.
yeah, what is catechism?
So, I got to go way back to my Catholic days. But catechism, it was like the whole education process. So I'm sure there's different, that's changed over the years. But what I remember is like every like Tuesday night, we'd meet together with other kids our age, and then a spiritual leader, and we would discuss all kinds of stuff, not just related to faith, but also how like faith relates to our everyday lives and all that. And the idea, at least it seemed, was to process things that are going on and to kind of figure out where our belief system fits in with our experiences.
Okay. Yeah, I did a bit of
There.
that in my youth too. Um,
Mm-hmm.
we had a we did this on Friday nights. It was just youth group, and I'm pretty sure they timed that as an opposition to us doing other things they didn't want us doing on Friday nights. That was quite clever
Right.
of the church.
But you probably did more fun stuff.
We had pizza, and yeah, we just had a short devotional, like a half an hour devotional, and then we would play games and eat pizza and all that. So that was a good time.
Right. So that's cool. So growing up Catholic, here in Maryland, it was very different than when I went down to Florida and visited my Baptist cousins, right? And in their faith system, they had fun, they did all cool stuff and all that. And at the time when I was a kid, that seemed like the coolest thing ever, right? Because they just enjoyed their time together, and it seemed more like in line with normal kid stuff.
Right.
Had a nice like wholesome bent to it, which was nice. But in my Catholic system, it was very traditional, and it felt very like inauthentic to the adolescent experience. So I remember
Yeah.
that being a pretty big divide between them, and I thought that was interesting for sure. So I definitely preferred the Southern Baptist side with all the really cool, fun music and
Right.
all that, versus
The
like the church
instrumental.
organ and all that kind of stuff too. Which now I
Yeah.
prefer the church organ stuff as far as music taste. But as a
Right.
kid, I wanted like In Sync and shit. So which is
Yeah.
totally valid.
That's There are different forms of indoctrination, and maybe we can talk about that a bit too. I was in a fundamentalist Church of Christ. It was just fundamentalist Christianity, I suppose, and
Hmm.
they would always tell us that like all the religions are just denominations of this religion. Like this is the best one.
Mm.
That's how they
Right.
always. Because the other 5,999 religions are completely wrong.
They got it wrong.
Yeah, I mean that's it's it's so easy to be indoctrinated, and I've seen videos of preachers and priests saying that, like, actually using that word, we're intentionally indoctrinating children young, because that's when it's appropriate to bring those ideas into play. And
Right.
yeah,
Does
that's
it
what I'm
not just
talking
hit
about.
your ears so poorly though?
Yeah, yeah, it's very unfortunate.
Yeah.
I mean, what does indoctrination mean to you? Like, what do you think about that?
Indoctrination, I would say, like perhaps like imposing a dogma on people like systematically.
Right.
Um, just off the top of my head, it made sense in my head at least. It's
Yeah.
like we're gonna kind of like inundate you with information we want you to have.
Yeah. Yeah,
It's
that's for sure.
so, and that's a very like general thing too. But there is like a certain like charge to the word indoctrinate versus just like learning, right?
It's
I
like
see how that
coercion.
line could be blurred, but it seems to mean
Yeah.
something specific here.
I mean, other words could be persuasion or coercion, but when we think of coercion, that's more like there's a deal. Like, if you don't do this, there'll be consequences. With indoctrination, it's like this is going to be your whole worldview. And again, we have the problem of
Mhm.
good good intentions creating unintended consequences, like we talked about with psychotherapy.
Yeah.
That's man, it's like, how do you get around that? And it's so hard to criticize, because we know that our parents and our relatives and our friends who are doing this, who are involved in indoctrination, are mostly doing so from a place of love. So, for example, um,
Mhm.
I've heard this from my parents, and I've heard it from my friends saying this about their parents, saying this to them as well. I just want to know that I'll see you in heaven when I die. That's how do you respond to that? Like, I mean, I just said, yeah, me too, mom, but it's like I don't believe that at all. I don't believe I'm gonna, like, we don't know, and it's supposed to try to embrace as much of the not knowing as we can, at least as far as I understand philosophy now.
Yeah. But I think that's a big divide between like philosophy and just like general comfort.
Like life philosophy, I guess you would say, like the way I want
Yeah,
to
yeah,
live,
yeah.
you know.
Well, exactly. But just when I think philosophy, I think like let's explore these big, tough questions and let's see where it takes us.
Right.
Being more like scientific rather than, like, um, you know, here's what I want to happen and let's work backwards from that.
Right. This reminds me of
You
the
know,
Epicurean paradox. Let me see if I can pull this up. Sorry, you can keep speaking. I'm just speaking.
no, you're good.
Like,
Epicurus, all day.
I think it was Epicurus. So there's the thing where he has just this line of yeah, here we go. Let me share this here because this is
Please.
So this is the Epicurean paradox, and I'm gonna try to zoom in here. So we have lines of reasoning. This is approaching logic in religion. Like, this is how we can think about God. If evil exists, does evil exist? If yes, then can God prevent that evil? If not, then God is not all powerful. If he can, then does God know about all the evil? If he does, then we can ask, does God want to prevent the evil? If not, we can ask, then God is not all knowing, or we can assume that God is not all knowledgeable. Not omnipotent would be the word.
Right.
And so if we ask, does God want to prevent evil? And if he can't, then we can think, then God is not all good. God is not all loving, which is that's the idea of, what's it called? Privatio boni. Everything made by God is boni, is good and love. And
Right.
everything that we consider evil is not really evil. It's just the privation of all that is good. And so everything is all good. And I kind of like that way of thinking. But so if God does want to prevent evil, then why is there evil? And so here we go with this line of reasoning. We can ask, if it is necessary for the universe to exist, or other reasons, then could God have created a universe without these? And if not, then we go back to this: God is not all powerful. And then if he can, then why didn't he? Why didn't he create a world without evil? And if it's because of the free will argument, then could God have created a universe with free will but without evil? And then we go in this circle of, if that's true, then why didn't he? Like, why didn't he do that if he could have? And then we have this other idea here, asking then why is there evil? If God is all-knowing, he would know what he would do if we were tested. Therefore, there's no need to test us. And then if it's to bring Satan into the picture, an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God could and would destroy Satan. So that's where I kind of land my reasoning. Like, all of this to me just says God does not exist. Like, this is very, very obvious. But I feel like I lean more left-brain. Like, maybe that's more, like, when I think about what is valuable to people, because I don't want to just tell people that God is not necessary in their life. I don't want to think that, like, everybody has it figured out either. I don't want to try to tell people how to live, because it might be, there's the argument of the opiate of the masses, and what that sounds like is saying, let's just let people believe in God because they're too stupid to figure it out, and they need these little fairy tales to make themselves feel good in the world. That's the harshest language I can put that in, and I also kind of agree with that. You know what I'm saying? Because most people don't know what's going on. Like, nobody knows what's going on. That's why philosophers are like, even the best philosophers of old and today get caught in their own narratives and try to, like, figure things out from a particular lens, or like a few lenses at most, maybe like 3 or 4, if you're taking the polymath approach that I'm trying to do on my channel. And that's, all of these ways of thinking can lead to elitism and lead us to think that we have it all figured out. And so I just want people to be happy. I just want people to like, be honest with themselves, but it's not up to me to dictate what is being honest to yourself, you know, because if it is like if genetics set you up to be more right-brained, then maybe it's being more true to yourself and true to your genetic prerogative to live in that way, and no one can say that that's right or wrong, because nobody can see inside your head, and nobody can, you know, test this chemically or neurochemically, I guess you could say.
Right. So this is a weird one to me because I've always leaned more toward, I mean, I'm very much, I don't want to say hard atheist, but I'm an atheist. Um, but I always thought like pantheism was way more compelling. But in pantheism, that's kind of like not even a thing there, right? Like, because, in at least one form of pantheism, you could say like everything would be God. Every single way you split up a God would just be like individuations of the all, right? And the all being the God,
Right.
right?
That's kind of a just a rant, but yeah. I mean, so there's the concept of apophatic versus cataphatic reasoning. Are you familiar with this?
No, you'll have to enlighten us here.
So, apophatic means saying, like, feeling like it's okay to say what God is not, and then cataphatic is the process of trying to describe what God is. And so I
Hmm.
tend to lean towards the idea of apophatic. Apophatic is probably the best way to approach this if we're going to talk about God at all, because we can at least say, like, we can at least use evidence and reason to figure out where God is absent. And this is kind of where science comes in. And it's also very lined up with the Epicurean paradox. And then the more, I guess, what you would call religiosity and also religious ways of thinking would be more cataphatic. And it's so easy to get caught into that, like that's God, and God is within that thing, and that's a beautiful waterfall because God made it so. And I see this all over Facebook too. It's hard
Yeah.
not to laugh at it, to be honest, but yeah.
Well, so this is a weird one to me because I've always leaned more toward, I mean, I'm very much, I don't want to say hard atheist, but I'm an atheist. But I always thought like pantheism was way more compelling. But in pantheism, that's kind of like not even a thing there, right? Like, because, in at least one form of pantheism, you could say like everything would be God. Every single way you split up a God would just be like individuations of the all, right? And the all being the God,
Right.
right? That's one way of looking at it. So it's interesting to me if I look through that lens that if there's going to be a God and there's going to be a devil and all that, and it wouldn't even work. Like, how do you have something that's not God, right? If God is everything,
Right.
right? But I know in many faiths, God might be outside of time and space, right? So
Right.
that
Right.
what I mean. So like we're operating from very different areas, but when we're talking about God, um, whether or not God exists, I don't think we could really know anything about God other than things that we could impose our logic systems on.
Right. And so it's a more humble perspective to say what God is not. It's more humble to come
Right.
from an apophatic way of
But
thinking.
also, I can see that, I can appreciate the perspective. But in the pantheistic perspective, I can't imagine what God is not. I mean, it's almost like imagining what nothingness would be, right? Like I could logically like conceptualize what the absence of everything would be, but I don't actually think that there is nothing, right? And we know from your fairly preliminary ventures into quantum physics and all that, like there is never nothing. Like everything's made of something. If we're talking about
Right.
you know quarks and Higgins particles and dark matter, dark energy, and all that, right? Like there really isn't a complete vacuum
Well,
ever.
so yeah, and so people want to say that the Higgs boson is like the glue that holds matter together, and so like if you have that, then you can't have God. I mean, I think the idea is that like it's hard to say that when we have molecular biology and we have natural selection and the process of trial and error in evolution, and we can like track this back step by step by step. It's
Hmm.
really hard to say like God brought this about because you can see how things came into being because of evolutionary pressures. I mean, well, from the panspiritist perspective, I guess like this guy here, Baruch Spinoza, he kind of
Yeah.
really set that in place. And there are other ways of thinking about this before then, but I feel like Baruch really, he really formalized this. He really put this into a form of geometric unity or a form of like scales and measures, and very much formalized it. If you've ever read Ethics, it's really his main work.
Sure. Yeah.
Man, it's so well done. He gets into the emotions as well, and he lists like I think 54 emotions, and that's I really like that. Like, and Einstein did too. Apparently, Einstein said that if I have to choose a god, I would choose the god of Spinoza. But Spinoza was kicked out of town though, because he was a Jew, I believe, and he was Jewish, and he wrote this book, and he had to leave town. He changed his name because of it. Like, his original name was Baruch de Spinoza, but he changed it to Benedict, and Benedict Spinoza. So that's really risky, and it was very risky at the time of his writing. Like, he was a and the irony is that he was a glassblower, making glasses for people so that they could actually see reality better. And
right,
he died, we think, because of the glass dust.
Oh wow.
Yeah, so
that sucks.
What a crazy story for a philosopher, and he died young too. Like, he was in his, I think, early 30s or so. But,
yeah, as I drank from a glass.
Yeah, what a beautiful glass too.
Thank you. It was very cheap, but it's beautiful still. Cheap's okay.
A lot of people talk about Spinoza too, and it's like that's what we need from the philosophers, is to like really formalize this into kind of like mathematical reasoning. I think if we're going to try to say where God is and where God isn't from the Cataphatic perspective, I suppose.
Yeah, I still think it's tough though, because we haven't actually pinned down what God is. So you get in this like infinite like regress of like, well, to understand God, we need to conceptualize God. But then they're like, but what are we conceptualizing if we can't actually observe it? And then people will insist, oh, well, I've observed God. And I'm like, well, do we know that? You know, which I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying, like, I can't just take your blank statement, you know, at its face value, saying that something is God. I could say that, you know, honestly, I could say, I believe that you thought this thing was God, or you didn't have a good schema for what else it could be.
Right.
You know, and I want to have an open mind, but I feel like a lot of these people making these claims just don't have any grounding at all.
It's like they're coming from a place of feeling and instinct and emotion first, which is not necessarily bad. It's good to be able to trust your instincts, but also they can be very deceiving, as we learn about in psychotherapy.
Well, I agree. Well, we talked about like evolutionarily, right? It could have been evolutionary adaptive at some point in our history, maybe even now still, right? To believe in things that we can't possibly know, right? There's the famous, like, the Dawkins example of, like, you know, it was helpful to think that there was a demon in the bush because that would help you avoid the bush, even though it might have been a tiger, right? It almost doesn't matter what was in the bush. It was still like a survival advantage to avoid the bush.
And that's like superstition, right?
Yeah, and just so, you know, you could see a lot of religion as that, right? Like, a lot of the holy books are just like the superstitions and the cultural practices that have helped people survive in the past, right? And maybe they're not that useful anymore, but they were useful at the time. Or maybe they're more useful at the time. You know, so that's another way of looking at it.
I mean, this is what John Vervaeke talks about with Awakening of the Meaning Crisis series, or Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. Like, we're in a meaning crisis right now because the main source of meaning and purpose, and also fulfillment in life, and also identity, was supplied from on high until we hit postmodernity and science ruined everything.
Well, yeah. But then we can also get into like, did that actually provide the sufficient like nourishment for our like self-development and our,
I don't think so.
Right, because I don't think so either. But maybe it was useful just practically for survival or like politically, maybe.
I mean, it's like the way that I think about this with the whole universal embodiment perspective. I need to get back into writing on this. It's like the universe is experiencing itself through human vessels and through all the other creatures too. Like, Schopenhauer talked about the great eye of nature that looks out through every creature, which is an amazing concept. And it's like at that stage, and I don't like using levels either, and we're going to get into like hierarchies as well here in a bit, but I like to
Right.
think of it as types. Like these are types of experiences that the universe can have, or like matter can occupy in a particular organic vessel. And
Right.
so maybe that's what a meaning system looked like for the people that were existing at that time, and that's
Hmm.
just fine. Like that's if I were to go
Yeah.
back in time, I would make philosophical arguments for that had I known what I'm knowing now. I guess you know what I'm saying.
Right.
And now
If that was
we're in a
possible,
different
yeah.
time. Yeah. And
Yeah.
so now we're in the time of post enlight or post well, also we're trying to get to post enlightenment, but post modernity and hitting like meta modernity, and we're really trying to figure out what the
Hmm.
parts of post modernity are worth preserving, and what's deceiving us. And that's the type of experience that the universe is occupying at this moment. It's not necessarily better than what we had
Right.
before, but it's the lot we are cast. It's the affordances, like I like this term. I think that's Merleau-Ponty. The affordances that that reality gives to us and that we can
Hmm.
experience through. That's what we're working with now, and in the future, probably a few hundred years in the future, it'll be artificial superintelligence, and we'll be able to ask a lot of these questions and look from the perspective of a possibly more sentient creature or a different type of sentience, different type of consciousness and intelligence, and understand what it's like for that kind of entity to exist and experience God, experience meaning and identity and all that.
Yeah. I could see that totally.
What do you think about God? And we shouldn't spend too much time on this, and we're not trying to do a long one tonight. How do you like? How do you think about God today?
So I think that God is. I could see God as being like the glue, right? I think like early in my atheism, I would have been like, "Oh, God just like doesn't exist." People are making these things up just so like they could have some meaning and purpose in their lives and make sense of things, you know.
Right.
But I see now like you could see God as many things. I mean, God maybe is luck, right? I know we're pretty both of us are pretty hard determinists, right? So maybe God is just all the prior circumstances that led to today, right?
Right.
I could see that being kind of compatible with, well, compatible in the other way, right? With other belief systems about God, right? Where it's
Right.
like God has a plan for us, and well, if God wills it and stuff like that. I would have scoffed at that more before, but now when I hear things like that, I hear it in a non-religious way. I hear it in a that's just the generic term for things you don't understand and for things that are outside of our control. And I think that when I started to define God that way, God became more of an okay concept for me. Not that I would use it, right? I wouldn't use that term, but when people say things, I conceptualize what they're saying
Right.
in that way, and that's helped me be a little more peaceful with the concept and a little more understanding of other people's understanding.
Yeah. Some people use the term the like replacing the word God with the universe, and
Yeah,
I think that's quite
that's fine to
constructive.
me.
There's another quote that goes, uh, "When we use God to explain where science has yet to tread, that's putting God into an ever receding corner." Now
Right.
that's
Yeah.
hard determinism. That's the hard scientist determinist way of thinking.
Yeah. Well, also, like if you look at, let's say 3, 4, or 500 years ago, the things that we said it has to be God. We've come to the realization that no, we can explain things via the natural laws of science,
Yeah.
right? And then flip side, people could just redefine the natural laws of science as that's God, right? Like if these are the principles in which our universe operates in, then that's what God is. God is just the those universal principles. And it's like to me that's fine, but this constant movement of the goalpost and redefining of what God is makes what they claim is colloquially God seems less like the classical God, right? And
Right.
it's like the term is transforming, I think.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to not fall into infinite regress, like you were saying earlier.
Yeah.
That's the same thing I talk about with people that are in support of simulation theory, because then you have to ask like who created the simulation and then who created that, and it's turtles all the way up or turtles all the way
Right.
down.
Yeah, that doesn't solve the problem,
Yeah.
right? Like if
So we
God
have
is
to
outside
accept.
space and time, then how did God even, like, what does that even mean?
Yeah, and how do we interact with that if it's outside of space and time? Because that's the
Right,
entities that we are as space-time
right.
entities.
Well, how do we formalize and operationalize something that exists outside of space and time? Like it has no like existence at that point, right? Isn't that what that means? So like God doesn't exist.
Or like it doesn't. Yeah, I mean, in all that we know of existence, which is four-dimensional reality, he can't
Yeah.
exist, and that's all that we can contact. So that's contactless. And so like this is where I like the idea of radical acceptance and just accepting that as a mystery. That's one of the existential givens of life that we have to come to terms with.
hmm Yeah,
Because
I
if we know that
totally
we,
fall in line with that.
yeah, we have to accept what we don't know. Oh, also, I wanted to say, anyone listening to this, last podcast we did, there were some downvotes, and that's totally cool. I like the system of voting
Yeah.
on YouTube, even though they don't let people see the downvotes anymore, only the producer, which is hilarious. But I just ask, if you want to downvote, please leave a comment in the comment section just to let me know where I went wrong, or how I can improve my thinking in this regard. Um,
Yeah.
so
No,
what is?
just real quick too, like
Oh yeah, please.
I totally like I think both of us we want to know what's wrong, right?
Yeah.
With the discussions. You know, we're just people trying to learn and discuss things, and a lot of these things don't seem to have very apparent answers, and they're very complicated. And any bit of commentary that could shed light on these completely complex topics would be really helpful. I think we both want to learn as much as possible, and that's a collaborative effort. There, we're not going to get all the answers from one source. There's no way. So yeah, thank you in advance for any help you could give us.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is why I'm talking with you as well, Ari. I've talked to a lot of people over the past decade or so in my research, and the large majority of people are preaching a narrative, or they're coming from a place of hubris or pride and thinking that they know everything. And these are these rare instances where we can actually like have humble conversations where we're just trying to be open and understand things.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that being said, what is sacred? What do you define as sacred?
Um, I mean, to me, sacred is something that's just really high on the hierarchy of importances. Um, but I'm not like a spiritual person. That's another thing we'd have to discuss for sure. Um, so I don't know if I hold anything sacred in a traditional way, but to me, there are things that are really, really important to me. And I think it's worth reminding myself of those things, whether it's through some sort of ritual, um, or just gratitude or
Right.
whatever it is. So I'm probably the wrong person to ask about what
Well,
constitutes sacredness.
I mean,
So
maybe a ritual is sacred. Like it's what's most to me, it's what's most precious and most valuable, and it can be thought
mm,
of as a virtue and a value as being true to yourself, like exercise. Like I
right,
mean, you're a health coach and you're an exercise coach, and you know that if you don't have that aligned, like if you're not aligned with your exercising self, then you're not being true to yourself, and you're probably denigrating your quality of life. And that's not you're not holding
right,
yourself as a sacred thing. Like your life is not precious enough to you to give it value if you don't have those balanced.
right. Well, that's the I've heard this. I guess I could deem it like New Age, but I've heard people say like my body is a temple or my body's a vessel. Um,
Yeah.
or in any of that. And again, like you could scoff at that, but like I think that's important. Like in our limited understanding, our consciousness and all that seems to be housed in our physical space, right? That
Right.
we claim is our own. And I think it's important to, take care of ourselves, whether it's, physical or mental or spiritual. We have to believe that as helping professionals, that we can help align people with their true selves and to possibly transcend their old selves, you know and
Right.
align themselves with what they hold as important and sacred and healthy and all that too. If we didn't believe that, I don't think we would actually try to help people at all.
Right.
And we wouldn't try to help ourselves or better ourselves if we didn't think there was a better version of things. And so perhaps achieving a higher, level um, is a sacred endeavor.
Yeah, and this is where I would say it is appropriate to think in terms of levels. So, and that the way you said that too, like your body is a temple, that actually is in the Bible as well. Your body is the temple of the Lord, and I think this is a direct example of where we can think of comparing universe and God. If you are the universe experiencing itself through a human vessel, then you also have a duty to consider that as a temple for that universe to reside in. And
Right.
just saying that right now to myself is like, wow, that's such a cool notion, like I'm so
I
excited
love
about
that.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Well,
And it's
maybe
not like
and
hippie
this
either. Like that's completely natural to describe that way, I think.
right. Well, I mean, it almost seems like that's kind of if that is like a Christian idea. I'm not saying it's exclusively Christian, right?
Yeah.
But it seems like it's kind of a lost virtue, perhaps in Christianity.
Oh, I'm thinking of like I'm trying to think of how this is taken in the East, and when we look at Buddhism, it's so there's different ways to look at Buddhism versus Hinduism, but like the idea of escaping samsara and the cycle of rebirth is to be
Right.
done with this vessel and to establish yourself in the distributed oneness of everything. And that's like we're talking earlier about like lateralization versus verticality.
Right.
That's like the ultimate lateralization. That's the ultimate horizontal, is just to dissolve
Right.
into the ether and become the atoms of the universe. Analytical idealism also gets into this idea too, but that's taken more from I guess, philosophical proposition, or like modern philosophical proposition. And that's
Yeah.
weird. Like I don't know how to feel about that right now.
Well, I mean, the early Christians, a lot of them felt that way too. I mean, so if you look at Gnosticism, um, as much as you could pin something as being, Gnostic Christianity, a lot of the idea was that, like, we live in an evil, imperfect realm, and, through gaining sacred knowledge, we could escape the evil world and we could return to the perfect world, right? So it sounds very similar. I could see the Eastern influence
Right.
coming to that thought process, right? So it was like, this world doesn't matter that much, but we, can do better in the next world. So we kind of have to, like, deny our bodies, right, and the physical pleasures, because physical pleasures, place us more firmly in this life, right? We gain more attachment to this life, and this is the false, the imperfect life, right? So that it takes us away from the things that really matter, right? So it's less sacred to live a purely, physical, hedonistic lifestyle.
Right. It certainly seems so. I mean, so some of the existential psychotherapy training I've had have actually encouraged what they call rational hedonism, and this is a kind of thing where it's not wanton hedonism. It's not like you're losing control of your life. You're just accepting that this life is temporary, and so you want to get as much out of it as possible. This also lines up with Satanism, and people
Yeah.
get tons of red flags when I bring up Satanism, but that's one of the major tenets there, is this idea that things are temporary, and we're going to take a responsible approach to having the best time that we can in the time that we have. And that's also quite tentative. So speaking of this idea of this whole transcendence, I want to share this image. So this is like we were just talking about the lateralization versus the vertical transcendence towards God. This image is from, it's called the Great Chain of Being. Thanks ChatGPT for supplying that name. I've been wondering about that for a while. So
That's a cool name.
yeah, it's so like this is just powerful imagery, but also very problematic. So I'm going to describe this, and I'm going to like talk about how Daniel Schmachtenberger talks about it too, and I'll try to do this quickly. So here we have down at the bottom, you can see my cursor. We have the Bible talks about the creeping things when it talks about insects, which I think is hilarious, and then the beast of burden, or the yoking of the ox.
Yeah.
You have that in, and so you have the insects and the smallest things, and this is where you see like atomism and all that as well, and then the plants above that, and then the beasts of burden, like you see an ox and a horse and all these, and then fish and birds, Obviously, like the birds are flying in the air, so they're quite literally above us.
Right.
They're above those creatures, like, but again, above them are the humans. So the birds are like the creatures of the air, but they only have such capacities. And also really cool symbolism here in the middle. And then above them are the angels, and then above them are the archangels, and then of course at the very tippity top is God. So look at this line. You have literally a physical line of transcendence running straight through all this.
Mm-hmm.
Like this is
Yeah.
what, and so it's important to note the history of art as well in this. Art is like all they had. It's all humans had for millennia until we got video, until we like figured out how to make flip books basically. And
Right.
this is what, like, people would go to the monasteries, they would go to the churches, and they would just stare at these images, and this would be like a form of entertainment and deep reflection. So like they would focus on this image right here in the center, or like this particular depiction of this bird, and like what does that bird mean to me. And so that you could stand in front of a painting for like hours. So when we go to do like art museum viewing, we get kind of a taste of that, but it's not at all like what people used to experience in the days of old. So the way that Schmachtenberger describes this, he's a social philosopher. He describes how about 5,000 years ago, this way of thinking kind of really set in. And so again, this is like 11th, 12th century, but this goes way, way back. So the separation of the lateral oneness and connection with all animals, this was thought of as animism. And yes, this includes the idea that animals had spirits and souls, but also the idea that just we're all organisms in this together. We're a team, and we need to treat all forms of life with as much respect and empathy as possible. When the agricultural revolution came along, that's when we were forced to consider, what do we do with these animals? The moment Schmachtenberger says it like, the moment that we yoked the ox, that's when we began to consider the beast of burden, and that's when we started using the term beast of burden. And we were kind of pushed into that by the available technology. So really a lot of the fault here is just the available technology that's been going alongside evolution and like tempting us in various ways. So that's where you kind of see the Western-Eastern divide, at least the divide of animism versus categorization, separation, and like we were talking about before, the in like literally in Genesis, the first book, there's Adam being able to, or being permitted to label all the creatures. Like he is the namer, the human is the great namer of all things. And this, like when I heard this, man, like this just blew my mind. I'm like, man, it's like it goes back that far. Like this separation of being one with everything versus thinking that we're better than everything and that we have a right to own this world. This world is put here for our entertainment, and the as some of my religious previous leaders used to teach me, the animals are here for our entertainment. And I've watched people step on bugs. I've watched people squash a moth and glorify a butterfly. I've watched people use electric shock collars on dogs. I mean, there's just so much abuse because we have like, it's just deep set into us. And I predict that this also is involved heavily in genetics because, or at least to some degree, genetics have set in because it's been maybe 5,000 years of thinking this way and believing and behaving this way. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense, right? If like you thought that using a cow to help you do your agriculture was the worst thing ever, that you're probably more likely to die off, right? Because that was like the prevailing technology at the time, right?
Or have a lower quality of living. Yeah.
Oh, for sure, yeah. But I would just say in general, right? If you had a lower quality of living, you're in simpler times, you would have been less likely to reproduce, right? It was more like Darwinian. Nowadays, it's very different because that's changed a lot. Because we could change what's adaptive in a society very quickly. So like for example, like being really super strong, and now I could cut down more stalks of corn. They're stalks, I think. But if you cut down more stalks of corn, you're going to be able to feed your family better, right? So you can have more kids, and you can pass that on. Whereas, physical traits, aren't as important now because if you have more money, you probably are more likely to have more mates, right? Or you can sustain more. more mates now. So like that kind of got rid of, our simplistic, selective measures.
And we also like poison our crops now. It's like it's not just technology;
Right.
it's just convenience. And technology and convenience are tied at the hip.
They're so strongly associated. Yeah.
Yeah, and we do it to our detriment. Like we poison crops, and then we just expect that people will wash their vegetables and wash their stuff properly. And it's
Right.
like, it gets into the food. So yeah, I mean, we're very foolish when it comes to technology and convenience, I fear.
Yeah. Well, I feel like our technology, and we're seeing this with, like, I think a lot of AI stuff too. Like, our ability to develop technology has exceeded our ability to use it responsibly. And
Right.
it's like, how do we, pump the brakes a little bit and come together as a society to decide, what we will tolerate, what we won't tolerate, and what we need to slow down on, and what we need to speed up on. I just feel like a lot of our hierarchy of values is just really screwed up at this
Absolutely.
point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we're not making good decisions in that regard. I mean, I've been writing about this for a while. As like I have a graph. I'm not going to bring it up. I'll just exemplify it. Like this is the path of evolution. It's like steadily increasing very slightly, and this is technology. Zoop.
Right.
It's like,
Yeah.
we're maybe like here or somewhere, or maybe we're like here, and it's just that dramatic that it might be this much more to come. You know what I'm saying? So there's different ways to look at that kind of graph, or if you want to, or like think of it as a chart, because
Right.
it's getting ahead of us. And the way I write about it is like our language is tangled alongside technology in its exponential curve. So we talked about in the previous podcast the idea of being bewitched by language, as Wittgenstein talked about, and we just make up words without really considering the impact that they can have, and we adopt words without considering the impact they're having on us when we do so.
Sure.
But that's also very true for religion, and it's
And technology.
yeah, yeah. I question like when we create the words from a place of feeling, and sometimes that serves us, and sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a balance that's needed there. Do it.
See, I'm wearing a Punisher shirt.
Oh my goodness.
Adopted by the conservative right, apparently, as I don't know,
Like, it's
a
just
Trump
so
image of,
ironic.
like this
but
skull with a Trump hair on it or something.
right.
I like.
I'm like,
Punisher.
yo, he doesn't like cops. Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, he was. I like it because he was a superhero that used. He didn't really use superpowers. He just was really badass with a bow and arrow, and that's like the coolest way to fight, in my opinion. But
Well, yeah, because you could associate with them more.
yeah, and I like shooting. I like shooting bow and arrow or bows.
Well, and maybe this is off topic, but kind of on topic. If you take something like, the Abrahamic God versus like the Greek gods, right? Like the Greek gods, they're much more human in many ways, right? So like I feel like it's easier to associate with them, and I guess that was kind of the point, right? Like yeah, the gods are above you, but they're kind of human like too. So like the lessons you gain from them are a little more one-to-one. We can relate to them a little bit more. Whereas like the Abrahamic God is so far above you, like transcends everything you possibly can know about humanity and life itself, that you are nothing like God
Right.
at all, right? And there's a disconnect, But then you have someone like Jesus coming in saying like, no, like you're gods, and any of these miracles that I'm doing, these are things that you could do too. Right?
Did he say it like that though? Because there are verses where Jesus is like, "Follow in my footsteps, and you will be able to handle these poisonous snakes."
Yeah. That's what I'm saying. It's there's that ability to heal that difference, right? But I feel like that's forgotten. Right? Like Jesus bridged that gap. And I think that's what made Christianity so appealing to people, right? It was like, you don't have to be the rich, powerful leader in order to get to heaven. Now you could just be poor and humble, and then you're more likely to go to heaven, right? So it's like there's this great equalizer in there, right? So you could make the low feel high, and you tend to balance that out a little bit.
Right.
But
it can
so
also
I
get
feel like
taken. Sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, like, it can be taken the wrong way as well. Like, you can think that you're ordained, and you can think that you're like the Pope, that kind of situation, where this is the man who is the demigod, or he has the voice of God. I like to think of Jesus as considering himself as a demigod and as a prophet. So, and Christians don't like to hear this, and people that are of the Abrahamic faiths, I guess you could say, or Judeo-Christian, like any talk about considering Jesus or Moses as just a regular old guy who's just doing the prophet thing that other people were doing in the desert back then. There were a lot of other prophets. There were a lot of other people that were preaching as if they were speaking from God, as if they were acting as the mouth of God. They just maybe didn't get as lucky. Like maybe Jesus got lucky with what we called miracles. And there are plenty of videos you can watch where this Bert Ehrman gets into this too, describing how you can describe each one of these miracles. You can explain it scientifically how they came about, like the Red Sea, or the turning of the not the Red Sea. When Jesus turned the river to blood or whatever, like there are things that can happen in the water that make that be the case. And it's like the strongest example. I don't want to get too much into this, but the one of the strongest examples is just like resurrection. There's potential evidence that shows that Jesus was studying in India, and he traveled to India to study with the Buddhists, or study with the whatever you would call that at that time. And because of the gap in, like, there's historical records of people migrating from that area over to India and over to the more Eastern religious countries, and that took place between the time period when Jesus was 12 and when he was in his late 20s.
Right.
The gap that we see in the Bible. And so maybe when he was, quote, resurrected, he could have potentially survived, and he had it set up for people to release him, and he just made his way into basically like captivity there, or not captivity, but just hiding. Like he was in a state of like religious hiding.
Yeah. But I think there's also like, it's almost like a messianic trope where like a lot of these great leaders traveled, to faraway places to gain secret knowledge. Right. And bring it back. And I think, and I don't have the specific examples, but I've seen a bunch where, at the time it was very popular to say, like, this teacher, they studied over here and they're bringing this knowledge back, right? So like I feel like whatever you want to say about the historical Jesus, I believe just as a storytelling, device that was common during that time in the Hellenizing world, that would have been a trope that would have been used very often. So, and that could, add to the mystique of a certain character, right? And the more mysterious someone is, the more divine they seem to, right? So whether or not that was intentional, I don't think it's a lie. I think that was just a feature of storytelling at the time.
Right. What do you mean by Hellenization?
So the Greek influence on Jewish thought. There's been increased popularity in discussing these topics, but it's still rather taboo in a lot of like biblical work. But the Christian and Jewish traditions were coming out of worlds that were interfacing with Roman and Greek ideas, as well as like Zoroastrian ideas, right? So like these ideas were not developed in a vacuum. And I think that people look at these sacred texts and they don't look at them in the cultural context from which they came out of, from whence they came. So I think people aren't getting the full picture, right? Because they're not seeing where a lot of these stories were coming from, right? They're not just purely, divine inspiration, given down to the prophets. I think a lot of these stories were being told elsewhere, at the same time, concurrently with these stories. And I think like, these, literary features were utilized to help spread the message. And that's a whole nother discussion, but it's really interesting the more I've been learning about this.
Yeah, and Bert Ehrman has a lot of research on this as well. Just the numbers of different translations and the variations on like intentional insertions into the versions that we have now, the King James Bible and ESV and ASV, and so Ehrman says there's like around 100 intentional, like major intentional insertions and alterations, and then there's like 10,000 mistranslations. They're just accidental. So we have the questioning of like putting your faith in something that's been heavily intentionally altered as well as accidentally altered. It's very tricky. But when you present these ideas to people, again, like maybe more strongly right-brained people, that's not so much of an issue for them because it's faith and belief that's at the core of what their meaning and their identity is in life and the way they act.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I say the word act, I should be specific. The enacted cognition and embedded cognition, like this is how we talk about in cognitive science, and forming participatory knowledge and procedural knowledge. Like these are things that you can't really have evidence for, and there's not a real scientific method for understanding what that means, but they are a form of knowledge. You have to know how to behave. You have to know how to move your body through the world and enact yourself, enact your cognition, and participate, like form a healthy sense of participation in the world. Some of that we can get from therapy. Some of that has to be done by experiment and finding the groups of people that you resonate with. All that.
Yeah. So, also related, I want to go back and talk about faith. I think faith is really important, and there's the overall discussion here. I think that we talked about like the power of words and all that, and like in a Christian sense, faith probably means something slightly different than in like a dictionary sense, right? And like our secular, our secular, good word, Freudian slip probably, but
Freudian frip.
I'm just slipping and fripping, but you know, like I think faith, if we define it really, simply, it's like sometimes you have to act or believe things that you don't necessarily have concrete evidence for, right? And I totally get that. I'm not going to deny that it's a thing, right? Because I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, but I know what I planned for tomorrow, right? And I have faith it's all going to happen the way that I expect it to,
Right.
right? Because like I do the same thing every Sunday, and the people I interface with are reliable people. So I have faith that things are going to go well, and I'm going to have a good time. And Sunday's my really fun day where I do music stuff and work out and just take a mental health day, so to speak, right? So I have faith in that, right? But I don't see that as a virtue. I see that as just a function of being a thinking entity, right?
Yes,
Who has
necessary.
some sort of like temporal sense. Um, but a Christian or another religious person might see faith as a virtue, and faith might mean something similar to them, but it also has another meaning too, right? Like they believe that after they die, they're going to go see their loved ones, right? It's different because while it may make sense to them, I don't think they actually know that if they die, they're going to go see their loved ones. They don't really know if their previous, you know, loved ones have done the same thing. They don't know if people are currently working towards that or if they're actually going to get there, right?
Right.
They just but they are in some way rewarded by their faith community for holding those beliefs, even against evidence, if there may be some, right? And that's seen as a good thing rather than just being a function of just making healthy evidence-based assumptions based on prior experiences, right?
Right.
Like, so if you believe in God because you've had something good happen to you that you can't explain, and then to extrapolate that to believing that everything I've heard about God is true, so that way I know that when I die I'm going to visit my loved ones and we'll be together, right? Like that belief about the future has nothing to do with the prior experience. You just associated two things that were
Yeah.
unrelated, right? So I don't know. It's complicated, so I don't know if I explained it correctly, but it makes sense in my
I
head.
see what you're saying. Yeah, I mean, we use the capacities that we have, and it's like it's a contingent requirement of us as a predicting entity to see towards the future. Like we don't
Mm-hmm.
just live for today. the brain does predictive processing as a major part of its cognitive functionality, is
Mm-hmm.
to predict and assume a threat, or assume a potential struggle, or assume a problem space to navigate, as we talk about in cognitive science and all that. And that's kind of what we do when we try to make plans for the next day and the next week
Right.
and the next year. And then this goes in direct opposition to Alan Watts and Ram Dass and all of them when they say, "Be here now." That's attributed to Ram Dass.
Mm-hmm.
That's such a powerful notion, and also I have to plan. Like I try to live by that, and also I have to, like I have a Calendly account where I have an online calendar that I share with people that I'm trying to work with and help improve their lives.
Right.
Because I'm predicting forward that they're going to have a better life, and that I'm going to also have a better life in helping them improve their lives. And we're all doing this on the assumption that there will be a tomorrow. But that also can take away from you enjoying the moment today. And that's
Right.
it's like there's always that trade-off in reality.
Mm-hmm.
So Peter Boghossian gives a good example of trust and faith. So he uses like the example of a questionable bridge. So the bridge looks a little weird to you, and you don't have your full faith in it. But then you have a bridge builder come along and say, "I put that bridge together. I can tell you that has great structural integrity," and he points out all the joint points, points out all of the areas where this is totally fine to cross, and then he goes across it himself and all that. It shows you physically that this is a safe thing for you to do. I put my faith and my trust and my belief in that physical person that has proven to me with evidence that that bridge is okay to cross. When it comes to taking a bridge towards religion or towards a eternal afterlife and all that,
Right.
I don't have reliable evidence. I like to use the example of a surgeon. I trust my life in the hands of a surgeon because that's a trained professional, and I would not necessarily trust that it's just all going to be okay because I have faith in this all-powerful entity that's overseeing me. And I feel pretty strongly about that today still. And I see people going through surgery and they say, "Oh, by the grace of God, this worked out. Thank God that this surgery was a success." And the surgeon's just like, "What the heck, guys?" Like, you know.
Right.
And anyone that doesn't like what I'm saying here, please let me know how you feel about this in the comments, because I like that example, and I still don't know how to feel about it. I just think that's a very, very strong.
I liked it. To me, it made sense. The bridge one did too.
Yeah.
Right? Like we have to base our actions, right, on prior knowledge. Right? And we always do that, right? We always, everything we have, everything we do carries a risk, right? Like one of the most dangerous things you could do is drive a car.
Yeah.
But we get in a car every day, right? But yet we see a spider and we freak out, right? It's like the chance of us dying by spider, right, is not very high, and just generally speaking, in our world here, right? But if you drive, you're more likely to die in a car. But we just get in the car. We're not necessarily afraid.
Right.
In general,
I think
right?
about that a lot, man, because it's like the
It's scary
American
world.
death machine.
Yeah.
I make trips to Virginia from Tennessee that are 650 to 700-mile trips, and
Ooh.
it's a 8 hours to 9 hour drive. And yeah, I think about, like, I question how worth it is because of the risk involved, and every time it's worth it to me because my friends
Yeah.
are there, and the people that I know the best and the relationships that I've established the best are there. But yeah, I could talk about that for a while too. So I was gonna ask, man, like, have you been looking into this whole transcendent naturalism thing with John Vervaeke, Gark Enriquez, Christopher Meister Pietro, and Jonathan Pageau?
I'm not familiar. If you give me like a brief synopsis.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, well, I can't because it's very complicated. But yeah,
Okay.
I mean, it's like the word choice there is really good. It is like the whole transcendence. Like Vervaeke uses the term top-down emanation and bottom-up transcendence, and they're really trying to unite this whole like vertical transcendental idea and transcendence with the horizontal oneness and the lateral connection with everything. And they're like, I'm trying to get more into it, and I'm trying to embrace that and enact that, and I'm trying to understand it more myself. they're these are probably some of the best minds in the world that are talking about this right now, and I highly encourage everyone to check these guys out. They don't get enough views, but when I look at world philosophers that are talking about religion right now, outside of the literature, these guys are the top of the line. They're really trying to come at this from a humble perspective, and really trying to find like joint points is the term that Greg Henriquez uses. Like finding these connections between the religions, and the more that they explore it, the more they're uncovering ways that both Eastern and Western belief systems are united as opposed to separated. So it's kind of just more of a shout out to them, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. It sounds like a complicated thing you have to dive into individually.
A lot of it is questioning like what is sacred and what's a good ritual practice. Rebecca uses the term the philosophical Silk Road, and referencing to the ancient Silk Road, where you could travel alongside it, and you can use these belief practices or ritual practices, and then get off at a certain point that feels right and is comfortable for you, that's both logically consistent and emotionally satisfying, spiritually satisfying, I guess you could say. Yeah, it's been going really well, and they have a series that's like a 4-part series, and then there's a lot of other series that they've done on the cognitive science show. That's another thing they talk about. There's another thing I was gonna say. I'm trying to remember. I don't know. All right, here's a fun question, and then we'll close this thing out. When Nietzsche said, "We have killed God, and we cannot wash the blood from our hands. We have unchained ourselves from the sun, and we are forever falling." How do you feel about that?
I mean, I like his like edgy poetics. Uh, I like them for what they are. Uh, to me, they speak to like my teenage side for sure.
Yeah.
And like, but really, when we get past the edginess too, like he really is getting at some important ideas. I think really he's speaking, to the time that he was writing that, people were coming to terms with the ideas that Darwin was presenting, and other, Enlightenment, or I guess Enlightenment ideas at the time, right? Where we were starting to look at, ooh, science is the way we're going to discern things, and religion, while it's still very present, it doesn't have the same exact hold and appeal that it did before. And without religion, we're kind of left without our easier, schematics for how to operate a society, right?
Yeah.
And it's like it could go different ways. You could have, like the hairiness of the French Revolution, right, which was like just very ugly, But then you also had like these beautiful like German minds, that he was interfacing with at the time,
Right.
and coming up with all sorts of like proto-existentialist ideas about what constitutes a meaningful life, and how to appreciate the world around you, and how to build a better culture, for example. So in my understanding, he, in the absence of God, he turned towards the arts, for his meaning structures. And he saw that you could find great beauty in, just meditating quietly, and, reading good literature, and listening to, good music, really inspired music. And you'd learn a lot because it would awaken those, internal, concepts that we have locked away within the deep reaches of our being. And he thought that we'd be able to get, more accurate information about the world from that than from, a God concept, because we indeed have ourselves, and that's all we know for sure. Like, we ourselves exist. Our emotions, our emotional responses to good art, reveal something about ourselves. That's something that's very real to us. Whereas God is just a approximation and that approximation is rapidly disappearing as science takes over.
Hegel wrote about that as well. Like Hegel was really into the aesthetics and
Mm-hmm.
trying to encourage people to embrace aesthetic philosophy. Yeah, yeah, and he wrote that quote in The Gay Science, I think.
Yeah, that sounds
Yeah,
right.
that's I mean, I guess that translates to the happy science, and I think that's what he was trying to get at with that. Is
Yeah,
that
or the science of happiness. Like,
yeah, yeah, right, right.
you know,
And so he arrived at the Übermensch as his grand revelation, at least in that and a couple of his other works. He really gets into that idea, the Superman, and there are theories that uh, his sister had his sister presented other interpretations of that made their way to Hitler, and then Hitler ended up embracing
yeah,
that and trying to live by that. And yeah,
I think that's what happened. The great shame is when I heard, all these, anti-Semitic accusations thrown at Nietzsche. And when you read his writings, he talks about how like anti-Semites need to die,
yeah, he
right?
was never promoting any of that. It's just this is the
No,
problem with philosophy in general, is that you can write, and it's also
yeah,
the style that you write in. Like Nietzsche was one of the greatest writers that ever lived, maybe the best,
yeah,
and literary prose and harmony and consistency, like philosophical consistency as well as internal consistency. And he he studied like various forms of writing to be able to write in the way that he did, apparently, and so that can
yeah,
speak to the soul in a way, or that can speak to the consciousness and the subconscious or unconscious in a way that we don't completely understand. And so Hitler could see that and see that, wow, I have all these attributes. I am the Superman, and I am therefore able to dictate what other people that are lesser, again, going back to the hierarchy idea, they're lesser than me, and so I can control these people. It's my It's like he's saying it's my duty to do so, and that's not really what Nietzsche was getting at least from my interpretation.
no, exactly. And I think it was in, oh crap, I forget which one, but it's my favorite one. I promise.
Thus spake Zarathustra.
No,
That's my favorite one.
oh, that's a good one. I just don't understand. I don't have the knowledge of Nietzschean thought to fully comprehend what he's writing there. 'Cause he's kind of putting together his advanced ideas into like a really cryptic
That's
biblical
he was
form.
he was trying to write his own Bible essentially, and I mean, he did a great job. Like
I thought it was great, but I was just like, I need to read it like 10 times to
yeah,
understand it.
you have to spend like sometimes like 20 minutes on one page, just like, wow, like this is just. And he would write like I imagine him also. So Verbeke also taught me this idea of Lectio Divina, so like the divination of the lexicon. And this is where you can have two books open at once, where you're comparing literature between authors and also deeply reflecting on the meaning of the book, so, and also the author's intention while they're writing it. So Nietzsche would do a lot of walking in the woods. He would do a lot of hiking,
Right.
and write notes as he was doing that. And so I just imagine him writing Thus Spake Zarathustra as he's having these grand revelations from nature itself and from life itself, and then
Yeah.
into like the perfect words. And yeah,
Well, that must have driven him crazy when he, was too ill, to go out on
maybe
his own. But also he was
we don't
sitting
know.
around, just not moving and all. But at the same time, his mental faculties weren't all there. He quickly deteriorated. So
Yeah, some people
maybe for a
attribute
little
that.
bit.
Some people attribute that to the syphilis. They say that can mess with your head in later
Oh, and
life.
I think, yeah, I mean, I think that's reasonable. Um,
There was okay, so we should
okay.
talk about this just a little bit.
Yeah, yeah.
There was one example where, like, this is where like it was in the news at the time. It came out in the press, and they say this is the moment that Nietzsche broke, like when his mind broke. He went out to he went sorry, let me back up. He was looking out a window, and he saw a horse being beaten by the carriage owner. The carriage owner was whipping the horse, trying to get it to move, and Nietzsche ran downstairs, ran outside, and threw himself over the horse to protect it from being whipped. Is that really madness? Is that crazy? Or is that the grand culmination of what he's realizing, that all life is precious and that's something to be defended, and we are monsters for the way that we're treating these creatures? Is that like a break in a way of thinking, in a more Eastern way, in a more lateral oneness connection way? I like to think that, like, because it's like, what is sanity, man? Like, what, and at what point can we act on that sanity? Like, I mean, you can be a sane philosopher and do some very strange looking behaviors. Like, we don't know what art is. I mean, is that a form of art? Is that an expression of something that he wasn't able to put into words in that moment?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of cultural bias too, and I know we talked about that too. Like, what constitutes being sane? You know, are you schizophrenic, or are you just like gifted with, more sensitive instruments, right, to interpret the world? But whatever the answer is, we have to look at those biases.
Well, this goes directly back to what we were talking about before. Like, you can't beat the ox and also be in a relation of oneness with it. You can't consider it as another type of organism. It's a level lower than you. You're at a higher level than it, so you're permitted to beat it. And yeah, maybe there's like an instinct of that within us that was kind of like bubbling forth in Nietzsche too. Maybe that's another way to think of it.
Right. Well, like maybe, again, I mean, like, if you go back evolutionarily, right, like, or at least just what was useful at the time, maybe we had to treat all animals as being subservient, right, because we needed that to survive these really strict, dangerous conditions. But like now we still have a lot of poverty and food insecurity around the world, but even here in the U.S. But we have more options for how we can get our food.
Well, the theory is that we used to be like the Native Americans, where it was not a fun time to be hunting. Like, this was something that we were forced to do because of the nature of our situation in life. And so they used every single part of the organism, and they prayed to the organism, and they did a spiritual ritual practice. And they had many beliefs around that, which I've tried to integrate that back into my own life. Not to get too into this, but I really do try to reflect on, especially because I have to eat meat. I have Crohn's disease, and I've tried to go vegan, and it didn't do very well. It was, and like, I really try to imagine what it is like to be a fish, what it is like to be a chicken, and to, like, I imagine, like, sometimes I even do this, and I'm hesitant to talk about this because it can sound crazy, but I mean, I don't really care anymore, because this is something I consider very deeply. And if anybody wants to challenge me on this, please do. Like, let me know how this could be crazy, how it could be useful. I do try to enact this. I do try to, like we talked about, cognition is enacted, extended, embedded, and embodied. And so I imagine what it's like to be an embodied cognition system swimming in the ocean. I imagine what it's like to be embedded in that with other fish. I imagine what it's like and I try to enact that. I try to do a procedure of that. I try to have procedural knowledge of that as I begin to consume the fish. So I'll use my hands for this process sometimes. Again, sometimes I don't, because it's still very weird and new to me. But the lived experience of your whole body, like the mind is it occupies the whole body. This is embodied cognition. That's why they use that term. This goes back to Husserl in the 70s. Your hands, like, you can have phantom limb syndrome. You can have unconscious movement. Like, if you have a severing of the corpus callosum, you can have an arm doing something that you don't intend it to. So it's kind of like we think that we're so different from the octopi, but really it's like, I mean, we say that octopi have brains in each one of their arms, but it's the same thing for us. It's just different. It's a different way of experiencing that. Right. We also have this happen when we sleep. Like, sometimes people will move when they sleep because the neurochemistry isn't stopping that. So anyways, I try to do that in my hands. Like, I try to do, like, this is what it's like to be the fish. Okay, I'm imagining that. I'm respecting that. This is what it's like to be a chicken, and this is what it's like to, like, pluck the feathers off the chicken, and to process the chicken, and to wrap the chicken, and now I'm, like, enacting the factory workers. If it's factory farmed, really try to avoid that system. But if it's like packaged chicken, I try to imagine what the packagers are doing too. So I'll do like a plastic wrap or whatever, and then so on and so forth. I'll do like mushrooms. Like, mushrooms probably feel like the way that mushrooms experience themselves and experience their own consciousness or intelligence or whatever. It probably feels like this to pop up because they come up overnight. Whereas plants, it's more gradual. They're more like this, and they form leaves by not so much bilateral symmetry, but more like geometry in nature. Like, we see the most efficient
Yeah.
pattern is being made, usually in this, or like this angle and then this angle and this angle. Those
Right.
kind of examples.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like, to bring back to kind of how we started, um, when you engage in these, we call them rituals, right? It sounds like you're invoking the sacred in your own life, right? And the sacred being, you are using your empathy, right, to live in harmony with the other creatures we share the earth with,
Right.
right? And
Life
that
itself
itself,
is sacred. Like that.
yeah.
That is what's most sacred to me, is life in all of its forms, and to
Mhm.
just brazenly consume that, like that doesn't feel right to me.
Right. So I could almost describe it as like you're ritualizing your hierarchy of values, right?
Right.
Yes, you have to eat and you have health considerations, so you have to eat meat, even though, like, it sounds like, ideally it'd be nice if you didn't have to harm other living creatures.
But plants feel too, and it's like we don't. So the
Right.
argument I get into online, I don't want to get into this too much either, but the like when I talk about this with vegans and vegetarians, and I try to explain that like plants have a form of consciousness and a form of intelligence, but most of plants they'll retract their leaves when they're prodded, and if you poke plants with a knife or something, some plants will curl up. Lots of plants quite literally scream. They scream in the 100,000 hertz range, so we can't hear them, but they'll call out for help, or they'll just call out in distress, or they'll send warning pheromones like grass does when it's cut. So tobacco plants and tomato plants will scream for particular insects to defend them from other particular insects and even small mammals. So like and of course I'm sure you heard about like mycelial colonies and how they act as intelligence
Right.
systems between plants, and also they have their own intelligence system that can be very much defended as something to be respected, and just a different type of consciousness, not necessarily a different level.
Right, all right. Well, so yeah, so let me revise what I'm saying. It sounds like to eat anything for us to survive, we have to inflict pain and suffering.
Everything is a sacrifice.
Right,
Every
everything's a
consumption is a
sacrifice, but
sacrifice.
yeah, but we can't avoid it unless we sacrifice our own lives, right? But it's like,
Antinatalism.
yeah, no, it's like that's like no, that's
Yeah,
so
I'm just-
bad.
yeah.
But no, but exactly right. Well, I guess that's why people go to that extreme, right?
Yeah.
I could understand that, but to survive, we have to eat, and to eat, we have to harm, and I think that by empathizing with other creatures through our rituals, right, that honor the sacred, it allows us to inflict hopefully less harm on other creatures because we consider the impact of what we're having on them, or we consider their experiences, whether it's plant or animal, right? Whereas if we didn't have that same hierarchy setup, right, we wouldn't care about animals or plants because they're beneath us anyway. And
Exactly. Yeah.
right, so we're fine with harvesting things any way we want to because we are not in touch with how they are feeling, right? So the best way to get in touch with how they're feeling is for us to act like them, or at least approximate that. And that very ritual helps us connect, and it also gives us more appreciation for what we have in our lives, right? And we're less likely to sacrifice things unnecessarily, but we realize that we do have to make sacrifices, and we will do our best to ensure that they are not excessively harmful,
Right.
right?
That's
So
like our
so
duty.
I
Yeah.
yeah, so we have that duty, right? But if you didn't feel like that was your duty because you didn't see things as being your equal, right, then that would lead to problems. So I think it's good for us to contemplate these things and to come together to find the least harmful ways of doing what we must do to
Right.
survive, right? And I think that's where religion can be very good, right, or very bad. And I think to tie that all together, the reason why I am not religious is because I don't think that religion or not religion gives us a better way of doing that. Like, I don't think I need religious practice to just be thankful for what I have and to exercise my empathy, right?
Right.
I feel like that is a a secular, you know, uh, humanistic function of our perhaps biology or consciousness or whatever.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
and so I'd rather just cut to that. I'm not going to add in extra baggage there, which I feel like, you know, for me, religion would be, but maybe someone else it would not be. Maybe that gives them a better, you know, schemata for how to do that, right? Or gives you better spiritual practices that allow you to do that better, you know. But so I guess to me, you can do whatever you want, you know, you could believe whatever you want, but I just hope that it leads to you engaging in healthy practices that are in alignment with our empathy.
Right.
So,
Very well said.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. This is where that's probably the main problem I have with Western belief systems in general right now, and I've been kind of on a exploration of comparison of actual differences between Western and Eastern beliefs and trying to avoid generalizing. But this is one where I see the problem most prominent today is that assumption that the world is here for our amusement and for our consumption, and this is where you see like a lot of activism around that as well.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, man, this has been an awesome discussion as always. Is there
Absolutely.
anything you want to leave with the audience? Anything from your exploration into religion?
No, no. I mean, I think I tried to distill all that into that last little diatribe of mine. That was from the heart. I feel very strongly about that. Um, I guess, yeah, I think whatever your belief system is, I hope that it leads to, you know, sustainable, healthy practices that are based in love and empathy. And yeah, other than that, I can't tell you what to believe, what not to believe. I believe you have the, you know, the freedom to believe what you want, but you just don't have the freedom to, you know, to harm people willy nilly. You better have really good reasons for harming people or harming animals. And I hope that you could think about it enough to be able to justify it if needed. So, and if not, then stop doing that. Find out what else you could do, you know, within reason.
Yeah.
So
Be
that's
honest
all I
with your
have. What about you? What do you think?
Yeah, that's like being honest with your intentions. It's very important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, so there is a cool concept from the East. There's a word called namaste, and this doesn't necessarily have to have religious implications. I talk about this in other podcasts. There are various translations. One of them is the light in me sees and respects the light in you, and you can take that from a secular perspective to say the incredible microcosms in me sees and recognizes the incredible microcosms that are in you. I realize that you are made of 35 trillion cells, and I am too, and that means I have 35 trillion reasons to respect you. You know what I'm saying? So
Right.
it's not just like hello, goodbye. It's namaste. Like you know what I mean?
Right.
Like there's so much to be said in this. It's not just a general departure. It's like you can hold precious and valuable interaction with anyone and any organism to the highest degree that you want if you try in that regard. And I think that word kind of encompasses that.
Yeah, I like that.
Heck yeah, man. Well, I appreciate it as always, Ari. This has been an awesome discussion.
Thank you. I appreciate it too, man. It was awesome.